Hi everyone, this is a recording which is part one of involuntary manslaughter. So in this recording I'm going to take you through one of the types, which is called Unlawful Act Manslaughter. And just so we're clear before we get started, involuntary manslaughter refers to a number of ways of being criminally responsible for killing somebody where a defendant does not have the intention to kill or cause serious harm. As we've learnt previously, where a defendant has killed and has the intention to kill or cause serious harm, they would be guilty of murder, which would then follow that we could apply a number of defences to reduce or remove their liability for murder in that way. Involuntary manslaughter refers to a killing, but the defendant does not have the relevant intention to kill or cause serious harm. So there are three main types. Arguably, reckless manslaughter is not needed, but it still is relevant today. So we will learn the brief requirements of that as well. For this session, as I said, we're going to go through unlawful act, otherwise known as constructive manslaughter. So the requirements I can split into three. The defendant must have committed an unlawful act, the act must be dangerous, and the act must have caused the death. So we'll go through each one of those in order. Please do feel free to pause the recording if you need to make notes or you need to go back over something that I've already said. And once this recording is live, you can then email me any questions that you may have for any clarity. So firstly, there must be an unlawful act and you need to recognise what that act is. Now, usually the unlawful act is going to be a criminal act. It would follow that anything that is unlawful is criminal. So typical examples of an act that you might see in a scenario may be a push or a hit or some kind of force applied against a victim. That would be deemed to be a battery. You might see something referenced in relation to drugs. So the supply or administering of drugs would be a criminal act. Potentially you may see something in relation to criminal damage, so setting a house or something on fire that then leads to the death of a victim would also be a criminal act. Additionally, those of you who have been looking at the Katia scenario would have identified her driving, so her speeding and texting on her mobile phone, both as unlawful acts under the Road Traffic Act. So you identify the unlawful act and then you need to state and apply the actus reus and mens rea for the act. Now, if the unlawful act is something that isn't covered within our OCR specification, then you would not necessarily know what the law is in relation to that act. For example, criminal damage, we don't learn on the A level, but you could identify the act and identify whether there's intention for that act to be carried out, but you wouldn't need to reference the origin of the law and break the elements down. If it's something like a battery, however, we will be learning about that, so you will be able to state and apply the actus reus and mens rea for that act. And I'll have an opportunity to go through that with you a little bit later. So hopefully you've researched and found the facts of Lamb. In Lamb, this case involved a defendant, Lamb, who was charged with unlawful act manslaughter. The unlawful act here being assault, in that the victim feared that shots were going to be fired at him. However, those of you who have looked at the facts of this case, the victim didn't actually believe that the gun was going to go off. So Lamb and both his friend thought that the bullets weren't in the firing chamber. So therefore, the elements of assault were not made out and the victim didn't apprehend immediate unlawful force. Equally, Lamb did not intend to apply unlawful force. So actually, although Lamb was convicted at trial, his conviction was quashed on appeal, and the Court of Appeal cited the reason as being a misdirection by the judge about what an unlawful act constitutes at the original trial. I have put a link here if you'd like to look at this case in a bit more detail. I found this website really comprehensive about this case, so I hope that helps. So we need to identify the actus reus and the mens rea for the unlawful act. Of course, Lamb is an illustration that the act and the mens rea may not be present, and therefore that defendant cannot be guilty if they are not. The act must also have been a positive act and not an omission, and that comes from the case of Lowe. Now, Lowe, although was initially charged with negligence and willful neglect, and sorry, willful should only have 2 L's, not 3, and if convicted of willful neglect, this would have indicated intention, and therefore he would have been guilty of murder, potentially, similarly to the case of Gibbons and Proctor we've looked at before. But his neglect, or act of neglect if you like, was found to be more negligent and therefore constituting an omission rather than being deliberate. So he couldn't be convicted of unlawful act manslaughter in the end because there was no act, rather there was a failure to act. So the correct offence should have been gross negligence manslaughter instead. In terms of actus reus and mens rea, don't forget that transferred malice still applies. So we could transfer the mens rea from the intended victim to the actual victim if we need to. And the relevant authority here is Mitchell. Remember, the founding principle comes from Latimer. And the facts are here. Mitchell tried to jump the queue at a post office. An elderly man took issue with his behaviour and challenged him. Mitchell hit the old man and pushed him. The man fell back onto others in the queue, including an elderly lady who fell and broke her leg, who later died. So he was convicted of unlawful act manslaughter. We have talked about this in class before. What was the unlawful act? The hitting and the pushing, and this would be a battery, or rather 2 elements of battery that have then led to the death of the elderly lady. And of course he appealed because he claimed that he didn't have intention to harm the elderly lady, but we can transfer the mens rea from the intended victim to the actual victim in that case to find him guilty. So that's how we transfer the mens rea for a relevant act. Secondly, the act must be dangerous, and this is decided objectively. So the question that comes from Church is whether a sober and reasonable person would see that the victim was at risk of at least some harm. So are the actions dangerous objectively? There is no requirement for the defendant to foresee their actions as being dangerous at the time. This is purely an objective test decided. And Newbury and Jones is a really good illustration of that. Despite neither Newbury or Jones having foresight of what might have happened, that a guard may have been harmed or in this case killed, it doesn't matter. There's no requirement for them to have realised that the act was unlawful or dangerous with what they were doing. Objectively, they are still guilty. And in this case, interestingly, Church and the case we'll look at next, Larkin, were both cited as being binding in this case. So they applied the objective principles here from those 2 previous cases to find both Newbury and Jones guilty. So that's an illustration of how precedent works here for you as well in a binding manner. So Larkin is good authority for the act needing not to be directed at the actual victim. And this is very similar to transferred malice, but of course it refers to the act itself. So in Newbury and Jones, for example, they are throwing a concrete slab at the train. They didn't have any intention or aim to hit the actual guard, but of course it doesn't matter for this. You don't need to direct your act at an actual victim. And Larkin is really good authority as well. So the facts here, where Larkin was waving a razor around trying to frighten somebody, but he actually ended up harming his mistress at the time and ended up killing her with the razor. Now, he did not aim the act at the mistress, but of course she was harmed through his actions, so therefore we can almost, if you like, transfer that act to her. So it works in the same way. So it was a dangerous act despite not being aimed at the intended victim. The act also needs not to be directed at a person, and Newbury and Jones again is really good authority because you're aiming the concrete slab at the train. But we've also looked in class a little bit at the Mick Philpott case, where he, if you remember, set fire to his house in order to claim a larger house, and ended up killing his 6 children. Now, he was convicted of manslaughter, and I've put the article at the bottom there for you. But Goodfellow is a really good, similar reported case. And by reported, remember, I mean it went to appeal. So Goodfellow, in a similar way, set fire to his house, intending to be rehoused, and killed 3 people in the process. His conviction was upheld despite the Unlawful Act, which hopefully you've identified as being the arson, the setting the house on fire. That's the criminal damage caused by arson, not being aimed at those victims. The act was aimed at the property. But it doesn't matter. Still guilty of Unlawful Act Manslaughter. And third and finally, the Unlawful and Dangerous Act must have caused the death. So we have causation rules that we need to apply. And I asked you to recap these. I'll summarise them for you now. So we have the but-for test first, the factual test. But for the defendant's actions, would the victim have died? And were the defendant's actions more than the minimal cause of death? So remember, there must be a link. You don't have to have been the main cause, but we must be able to link your actions to the cause of death. You've got the cases there as well. And then, of course, we apply any potential breaks in the chain only if they are unforeseeable or independent of the defendant's actions. So remember, there are 3 potential breaks. So you've got unreasonable actions of the victim, unreasonable actions of third parties, and palpably wrong medical treatment. And don't forget that the thin skull rule also applies. Take your victim as you find them. So if somebody has a weak heart or are more susceptible to greater injury, we are still going to find the defendant guilty of their death. We just need to apply that principle. So their particular conditions or vulnerability to death does not give the defendant a get out. Now, drugs have been a bit of an issue and cause for discussion in the courts, because there have been cases where a victim has been supplied drugs, they have ingested those drugs in some way and they've died, and the courts have had to decide, well, who is responsible for that? So the position is quite clear now, but I'll just take you through a bit of the history. So we had initially the case of Cato, and Cato injected the victim with heroin and was found guilty of Unlawful Act Manslaughter on the basis of the Unlawful Act being the administering of a noxious thing, and that comes under the Offences Against the Persons Act. So that was the Unlawful Act, of course, intention to administer that noxious thing being dangerous, and then, of course, causing death if the victim dies of an overdose, as they did here. So the position here was that Cato was guilty of unlawful act manslaughter. But then we had a similar case, but with actually distinguishing facts later in 1982, the case of Dalby. And Dalby and the victim injected themselves with tablet solution. So this was solution similar to, it was a pain relief really, similar to morphine. Now, the victim died. Dalby was initially convicted, but then his conviction was quashed. And this is because the Court of Appeal said that the victim's actions of injecting himself was the direct cause of death, rather than the supply of drugs. So this enabled Dalby to be acquitted based on an intervening act. And then we have a later case of Kennedy that has confirmed that, basically. And I've taken a summary of the judgment, which I've put here for you. And I'm going to read it out to you, and I really want you to take some time to digest it. So the court said, similar to the facts of Dalby, the appellant, and this is the person who is appealing, if you remember that's what they're called, the appellant supplied the drug to the victim, who then had a choice, knowing the facts, whether to inject himself or not. The heroin was self-administered, not jointly administered. The appellant did not administer the drug, nor, for reasons already given, did the appellant cause the drug to be administered or to be taken by the deceased. The answer to when is it possible to convict a defendant of unlawful act manslaughter in these circumstances is, in the case of a fully informed and responsible adult, never. So that indicates that where you are able to make that choice yourself and you choose to inject yourself or administer drugs, then the person who has supplied those drugs to you will not be responsible. Your actions will have broken the chain of causation for them. And interestingly, just a few years earlier in 2003, there was a case of Rogers, which you might want to look up. And this raised the question of whether defendants are responsible where they assist the victim to inject themselves. And in the case of Rogers, the Rogers held a tourniquet around the victim's arm. So that's something to restrict the blood supply, and then it pops the veins, basically. And the victim injected himself and then died of an overdose. Now, Rogers in that case was initially convicted, but going up to the House of Lords at that time, they quashed the conviction. They said they felt there was uncertainty over what the unlawful act was, because ultimately the victim still wanted to and injected themselves. So that's a case that you could look at if you're interested in this area. Okay, so that's the law of unlawful act manslaughter, and hopefully that makes a lot more sense. What I've put on this slide is a summary for you, so please do take the time to read through it. So when we are applying to a scenario, we are stating and applying each of the 3 stage tests. I've put a number of case citations in here. Remember, you need at least 5 relevant cases to gain maximum marks for AO1, knowledge and understanding of law. So the first stage being that the defendant commits an unlawful act. We identify what that act is. It must be positive and criminal, cannot be an omission, and mens rea must be present, which we can transfer if we need to. Secondly, the act must be dangerous, and this is judged objectively with a question, a test, and there is no need for the defendant to foresee any risk of harm or dangerousness. Thirdly, the act must cause the death. We apply the rules and then identify anything which may have broken the chain. Just keep an eye out for any particular issues there, like the drugs, any medical treatment, and of course if the thin skull rule applies, just keep your eye out for that. So going on to application then, you all have this scenario in your booklets, and I just want to take you through how I would answer an unlawful act incident in a scenario. So there are potentially three in this scenario that you could talk about. Ben, of course, being the defendant. So I've just planned an answer in relation to hitting baby Toby's head indirectly. So the facts, if I just read them here. So Ben is in a queue, a man squeezes in front of him. Ben pushes the man, who then falls into Christine. She drops her baby son, Toby, who lands on his head. So then you come to a bit later in the scenario. Christine and Toby are taken to hospital. And then it says Christine dies. Dr. Brown is sleeping off a hangover and does not examine Toby for 6 hours. Toby dies of his injuries. So we need to identify whether Ben is liable for the death of Toby. Now the question to this is about manslaughter, and hopefully you will have identified that this would be unlawful act manslaughter, potentially in relation to Toby. So this is how I would summarise it, and of course you'll need to come back and make notes on this slide, so please do take your time on that. So I've identified that Ben commits an unlawful act. First of all, he pushes the man, and this is a battery. The actus reus of battery being the application of unlawful force. So he's done that when he's pushed. It's a positive and criminal act. Now, with battery, what we will learn is that the force can be indirectly applied, so it can be a direct or indirect application of force. You might remember the case of Fagan, where the defendant indirectly applied force to the police officer's foot via a car. And of course, the force doesn't need to be directed at the intended victim. So we can almost transfer the actus reus there. Ben has the intention to apply unlawful force when he pushes the man. This mens rea can be transferred to the actual victim, Toby, through transferred malice. We do that via Mitchell and Latimer. So we've identified the first part. The second part, we identify whether Ben's act is dangerous. So by pushing the man, obviously it's a criminal act, it's likely to be judged as dangerous objectively. He may not realise his actions are dangerous, but there is no need for him to. Remember, this is objective, not subjective. And then thirdly, Ben's actions caused Toby's death. So I've identified, obviously, but for his actions, Toby would not have gone to hospital and died. His actions have therefore contributed to Toby's death. However, we have the issue of Dr. Brown here not examining Toby, a baby, which is quite critical, a vulnerable young person, for 6 hours. And he's not done this because he's sleeping off a hangover, which is really not good reason. So I've concluded that Dr. Brown's actions are potentially palpably wrong and potent in causing death. Remember, that's the test from Cheshire for palpably wrong medical treatment. So I've concluded that it's likely his actions would break the chain of causation here. I mean, practically, you can have more than one person responsible for the death. So we could have Ben and Dr. Brown. But of course, Dr. Brown's reasons for not examining Toby are not legitimate. This is a really serious breach here. Had he have been really busy, then that would be different. My answer would be different. But I conclude here that Toby may not actually be guilty of unlawful act manslaughter. Okay, so do please use this as your guide for answering. And you do have further practice in this scenario for Ben's liability to Christine and Ben's liability to Jack. So please do have a go at those and send me your answers. And then, of course, on the planner, you have this scenario to practice as well. You could certainly, whilst you wait for the gross negligence manslaughter recording, you could certainly have a go at the unlawful act part of this scenario. And I hope you found that useful.